The cold clang of subway trains crashing into the station echoed through the underground tunnel, yet inside one crowded car, a tension far heavier than the rush-hour crush hung in the air. A young girl's voice pierced through the clamor, sharp, insistent. "Everyone back! Everybody back!" The faces around barely turned. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're watching this on your phone during a hectic commute, or perhaps you're remembering a moment when a small voice changed your own life. It doesn't matter what time or place you're in. I promise you, today's story will reach deep inside your heart, stirring something you forgot was there. This is the story of Samuel Pierce, a man who built an empire from cold calculations and relentless ambition, yet found himself drowning in the very wealth that was supposed to set him free. At 45, Samuel commanded a financial dynasty from his glass tower in Manhattan's financial district, where millions of dollars flowed through his hands like water through a sieve. His investment portfolio read like a modern-day treasure map: stocks, bonds, cryptocurrency holdings that would make most people dizzy, real estate spanning from Park Avenue penthouses to beachfront properties in the Hamptons. Yet, for all his accumulated wealth, Samuel Pierce was the poorest man in New York City. The morning of November 15th began like any other in his sterile world. Samuel's alarm clock, a sleek German timepiece worth more than most people's cars, chimed precisely at 5:30. His penthouse apartment, perched 30 floors above the chaos of Manhattan, was a monument to minimalist luxury. Italian marble floors stretched endlessly beneath his bare feet, reflecting the cold LED lights that automatically illuminated his path to the bathroom. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of climate-controlled air and the distant hum of traffic far below. Every surface gleamed with perfection, yet the space felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Samuel's morning routine was as precise as his investment strategies. French-pressed coffee from beans that cost $300 a pound, prepared by a machine that cost more than most people's monthly salary. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up below him, yet feeling utterly disconnected from the humanity that moved like ants on the sidewalks. His reflection in the glass showed a man impeccably dressed in a hand-tailored Italian suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his face bearing the sharp angles that came from years of calculated decisions and emotional detachment. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that once sparkled with dreams, now held nothing but the cold efficiency of a machine designed only to accumulate more wealth. The ghosts of his past haunted these marble halls like shadows that no amount of light could banish. 3 years had passed since Elena's death, yet her absence filled every corner of his carefully curated existence. Her laughter had once bounced off these same walls. Her paintings had once brought color to the stark white surfaces. Her music had once filled the silence that now pressed against Samuel's chest like a weight threatening to crush what remained of his soul. The doctors had called it aggressive cancer, but Samuel knew better. It was life's cruel reminder that not everything could be bought, controlled, or conquered with wealth and determination. Samuel Pierce was a destroyer of dreams turned nightmare himself. In his glass office on the 42nd floor of One World Trade Center's vicinity, he made decisions that could topple small countries' economies with a single phone call. His hedge fund managed assets worth $12 billion. His cryptocurrency investments had made him a fortune when Bitcoin soared past $60,000 per coin, and his real estate empire stretched across 3 continents. Yet, each morning when he looked in the bathroom mirror, he saw a man who had traded his humanity for numbers on a screen, his capacity for love for the cold comfort of financial security that meant nothing without someone to share it with. The mansion in the Hamptons stood empty, its 40 rooms echoing with the ghost of conversations that would never happen again. The yacht moored in the marina collected dust while Samuel buried himself deeper in work, convincing himself that the next deal, the next acquisition, the next billion would somehow fill the void that Elena's death had carved out of his chest. His personal assistant managed a schedule so packed with meetings, conferences, and financial obligations that there was no time left for grief. No space for the tears that threatened to break through his carefully constructed facade of control and success. This particular November morning carried an unusual weight, though Samuel couldn't yet identify why. Perhaps it was the way the autumn light filtered through his office windows, casting shadows that reminded him of Elena's profile. Perhaps it was the anniversary of their first meeting approaching like a dark storm on the horizon of his consciousness. Or perhaps it was simply the accumulated exhaustion of living like a ghost in his own life, going through the motions of existence without truly being alive. The decision to take the subway that morning was entirely out of character for Samuel Pierce. His private car sat waiting in the building's underground garage, his driver ready to navigate the morning traffic with practiced efficiency. But something, a restlessness, a need to feel connected to the human experience he had abandoned, drove him down into the bowels of New York's underground transportation system. The Times Square station assaulted his senses with its chaos of sounds, smells, and bodies pressed together in the universal dance of urban survival. Samuel Pierce descended into hell that morning, though he wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. The subway platform stretched before him like a concrete cavern, filled with the flotsam and jetsam of New York's human tide. The air thick with the scent of coffee, exhaust, and the indefinable mixture of hope and desperation that permeated every corner of the city's underground arteries. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the grimy tiles, each step taking him further from the sanitized world of wealth and deeper into the raw reality of ordinary existence. The train that would change Samuel Pierce's life forever pulled into the station with the screech of metal against metal, its doors opening to disgorge a flood of humanity before swallowing another wave of passengers into its mechanical belly. Samuel found himself pressed against bodies he would normally avoid, breathing air shared by people whose struggles he had never considered, whose dreams and fears existed in a universe parallel to his own world of stocks, bonds, and cryptocurrency portfolios. In this moment, surrounded by the beautiful chaos of human life, Samuel Pierce was about to encounter a force that would shatter his carefully constructed barriers and remind him that some things in this world cannot be bought, sold, or controlled. They can only be received with an open heart. The subway car filled with the familiar symphony of New York morning rush hour, the rustle of newspapers, the electronic beeps of smartphones, whispered conversations in a dozen languages, the rhythmic clacking of wheels against tracks. Samuel positioned himself near the doors, his leather briefcase held protectively against his chest like armor against the chaos surrounding him. His eyes swept the crowd with the detached observation of a man who had spent years analyzing markets and reading people for signs of weakness or opportunity. It was then that he noticed her, a small figure standing near the center of the car, her tiny hand clasped firmly in her mother's grasp. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her clothes clean but obviously worn, mended with careful stitches that spoke of love rather than money. Her dark hair was pulled back in simple braids, secured with elastic bands that had seen better days. Yet there was something about her presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Her eyes, large, brown, and impossibly deep, seemed to hold a wisdom that belonged to someone much older, someone who had seen both the beauty and tragedy of the world and somehow managed to hold on to hope. The girl's mother stood beside her, a woman whose face bore the marks of hard-earned wisdom and endless worry. Her clothes were neat but threadbare, her hands rough from work that Samuel could only imagine. She held her daughter's hand with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood that love was the only wealth that truly mattered. When she looked at her child, her eyes softened with a tenderness that Samuel hadn't seen since Elena's last days, a pure, maternal love that transcended circumstances and spoke to something primal and universal in the human experience. The train lurched forward, beginning its journey through the underground tunnels that connected one part of the city to another, carrying its cargo of dreams, disappointments, and daily struggles. Samuel found himself studying the child with growing curiosity, noting the way she seemed to exist in a bubble of calm amid the surrounding chaos. She didn't fidget or complain like most children would in such crowded conditions. Instead, she watched the other passengers with a kind of gentle attention, as if she were memorizing their faces for some purpose known only to herself. As the train picked up speed, something shifted in the child's demeanor. Her grip tightened on her mother's hand, and her eyes began to dart around the car with increasing urgency. Samuel watched as she tugged at her mother's coat, whispering something that was lost in the noise of the moving train. The mother leaned down, clearly trying to understand, but the child's agitation was growing more apparent with each passing second. Other passengers remained oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst, lost in their own worlds of smartphones, newspapers, and private concerns. Suddenly, the child's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. "Everyone back!" she called out, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible given her size. "Everybody, back!" The words hung in the air, creating a moment of stunned silence before the usual subway sounds rushed back in to fill the void. Passengers looked up from their phones and newspapers, some with annoyance, others with curiosity, most with the studied indifference that New Yorkers had perfected as a survival mechanism in their crowded urban environment. Samuel felt his lips curl into a smirk that he didn't attempt to hide. The absurdity of the situation, a child no bigger than a sparrow trying to direct a subway car full of adults, struck him as both amusing and pathetic. After years of commanding boardrooms and making decisions that affected thousands of lives, the idea that anyone would listen to the frightened babbling of a little girl from what was obviously a working-class family seemed laughable. His wealth, his education, his sophisticated understanding of the world's complexities had taught him to dismiss such emotional outbursts as the domain of the naive and powerless. "What's this child babbling about?" Samuel muttered loud enough for those around him to hear, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to being right about everything. He glanced around the car, seeking allies in his amusement, finding some nods and eye rolls from fellow passengers who seemed to share his assessment of the situation. The child's urgency struck him as nothing more than the kind of irrational fear that children often experienced when confronted with situations beyond their understanding. But even as Samuel prepared to dismiss the entire episode as a minor distraction from his morning routine, something about the child's eyes caught his attention and held it. There was no panic in those dark depths, no childish hysteria or attention-seeking behavior. Instead, there was a kind of focused intensity that reminded him uncomfortably of the way Elena used to look when she was trying to explain something important that he was too busy or distracted to understand. It was a look that said the speaker possessed knowledge that transcended the obvious, that saw connections invisible to those who relied only on logic and evidence. Samuel Pierce had built his fortune on his ability to read people, to identify their weaknesses and motivations, to predict their behavior based on careful analysis of their words and actions. Yet, as he stared into this child's eyes, he found himself confronted with something that his analytical mind couldn't categorize or dismiss. For just a moment, his smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty that he quickly suppressed. After all, he reasoned, what could a poor child possibly know that he, with all his education and experience, didn't understand better? The child's mother tugged gently at her daughter's sleeve, her own embarrassment obvious as she tried to quiet the girl's increasingly urgent pleas. "Let's go, sweetie," she whispered, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had spent years trying to protect her child from a world that rarely showed mercy to the vulnerable. "Don't scare people." The woman's eyes met Samuel's for just a moment, and he saw in them a mixture of apology and defiance, sorry for her daughter's disruption, but prepared to defend her child against any criticism or mockery. Yet the child seemed oblivious to her mother's discomfort or the growing attention her behavior was attracting from their fellow passengers. Her focus remained laser-sharp, her eyes scanning the car as if she could see something that remained invisible to everyone else. When her gaze finally locked onto Samuel's, he felt an unexpected jolt of recognition. As if some part of his soul that he had buried under years of financial success and emotional numbness was suddenly being called to attention by a voice he had forgotten how to hear. "Back!" the child repeated, her voice rising above the mechanical sounds of the moving train. "Please, everyone, move back." The urgency in her tone was unmistakable now, cutting through the ambient noise and forcing even the most distracted passengers to look up from their private worlds. Some moved slightly, responding unconsciously to the authority in her voice, while others remained frozen in place, unsure whether to treat her words as a child's game or something more serious. Samuel felt his amusement crystallizing into something harder and more cutting. The spectacle of this little girl trying to command a subway car full of adults struck him as representative of everything he had learned to despise about human nature. The tendency to invest hope and meaning in powerless gestures, the willingness to be swayed by emotion rather than reason, the naive belief that good intentions could somehow alter the harsh realities of an indifferent universe. His laughter, when it came, was sharp and deliberate, designed to deflate the strange tension that the child's words had created in the car. "How's this for a show, huh?" Samuel announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the car with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard and heeded. Someone scared the little girl. Several passengers chuckled in response, grateful perhaps to have their own discomfort at the child's behavior validated by someone who clearly possessed the authority of education and success. The laughter rippled through the car like a wave, breaking whatever spell the child's words might have cast and returning the morning commute to the realm of normal, predictable human interaction. But even as Samuel basked in the validation of his fellow passengers, even as he felt his worldview confirmed by their shared amusement at the child's expense, something nagged at the edges of his consciousness. The girl hadn't flinched when the laughter started. She hadn't burst into tears or hidden behind her mother's coat as most children would when faced with adult mockery. Instead, she simply continued to look at him with those impossibly deep eyes, as if she could see straight through his expensive suit and carefully constructed persona to something underneath that even he had forgotten existed. In that moment, standing in a crowded subway car beneath the streets of Manhattan, Samuel Pierce found himself engaged in a staring contest with an 8-year-old girl whose worn clothes cost less than his morning coffee. And for reasons he couldn't explain, reasons that his rational mind rejected, even as his heart recognized their truth, Samuel felt as though he were the one being judged and found wanting. The child's gaze seemed to strip away his wealth, his accomplishments, his carefully cultivated image of success, leaving him exposed as nothing more than a man who had lost touch with everything that made life worth living. The train continued its journey through the darkness beneath New York City, carrying its cargo of human stories toward destinations unknown. But in that crowded car, something had shifted in the space between a wealthy financier and a poor child, something that neither Samuel's money nor his education had prepared him to understand or control. The girl's words continued to echo in the mechanical rhythm of wheels against tracks. "Everyone back! Everybody back!" And somewhere deep in Samuel Pierce's chest, a heart that had been frozen for 3 years, began the slow, painful process of learning to beat again. Samuel's mockery sparked ripples of laughter throughout the subway car, yet beneath the surface of his cultivated amusement, something unexpected began to stir. The child's unwavering composure in the face of adult ridicule created a cognitive dissonance that his analytical mind struggled to process. He had expected tears, perhaps anger, certainly the kind of emotional breakdown that would validate his dismissal of her strange warnings. Instead, She simply stood there with her mother, her small hand still raised as if directing invisible forces, her expression serene despite the chaos of noise and movement surrounding them. The weeks that followed became an exercise in reluctant fascination for Samuel Pierce. His morning routine, previously as predictable as the atomic clock in his office, now included an unexpected variable: the presence of this child and her mother on the same subway route. At first, he told himself it was mere coincidence, the natural result of two people following similar schedules in the vast transportation network that connected Manhattan's workforce to their daily obligations. But as November stretched into December, Samuel began to realize that his decision to take the subway had become less about experiencing the common humanity he had forgotten and more about observing this small girl who seemed to exist in defiance of everything his worldview told him was possible. The child, he learned from overheard conversations that her name was Maya, traveled with her mother every morning from their apartment in Queens to the school where the woman worked as a custodial assistant. Their commute began before dawn and ended after most people had settled into their offices, a daily journey that spoke of dedication and sacrifice in pursuit of goals that Samuel's privileged perspective couldn't fully comprehend. Yet, despite the obvious hardships reflected in their worn clothes and careful economy of movement, there was something about Maya that radiated a kind of inner light that no amount of designer clothing or expensive accessories could replicate. Samuel began to watch her with the same intensity he once reserved for analyzing market trends and investment opportunities. Maya didn't seek attention or approval from the subway's diverse population of commuters. Instead, she moved through their shared space like a small angel of mercy, offering her seat to elderly passengers without being asked, comforting crying babies with soft songs that seemed to calm even the most agitated infants. And somehow always knowing exactly where to position herself to help people struggling with heavy bags or mobility issues. Her actions weren't performed for recognition or reward. They flowed from her as naturally as breathing, as if kindness were an essential function rather than a conscious choice. One morning in early December, Samuel witnessed Maya help a blind man navigate the confusing maze of Times Square station. The man had become separated from his guide dog in the crush of commuters, his white cane tapping frantically against the tile floor as he tried to orient himself in the acoustic chaos of the underground terminal. While dozens of people rushed past, lost in their own urgent destinations, Maya simply appeared at his elbow and began guiding him with gentle words and patient directions. She didn't announce her presence or make a show of her assistance. She simply became his temporary guardian angel, leading him safely to his platform before disappearing back into the crowd. Samuel found himself studying this interaction with the same analytical precision he applied to complex financial instruments. What he witnessed challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature that had guided his business decisions for decades. Maya's behavior suggested that altruism could exist without calculation, that kindness could be offered without expectation of return, that some people might actually be motivated by forces other than self-interest or personal gain. These concepts threatened the philosophical foundation upon which Samuel had built his empire of wealth and emotional isolation. As winter deepened and the subway platforms grew colder, Samuel noticed other changes beginning to manifest in his precisely ordered existence. The silence of his penthouse apartment, once a welcome refuge from the noise and chaos of the financial district, began to feel oppressive rather than peaceful. The marble floors that had represented the pinnacle of sophisticated design now seemed sterile and uninviting. Most disturbingly, the stopped clocks throughout his home, frozen at the moment Elena had drawn her last breath, no longer provided the comfort of suspended time, but instead became glaring reminders of a life that had ceased to progress beyond the moment of his deepest loss. One particularly bitter morning, as Maya and her mother boarded their usual car, Samuel noticed the child singing quietly to herself. The melody was unfamiliar, yet haunting, a simple tune that seemed to weave itself into the mechanical rhythm of the moving train. Her voice, clear and sweet despite the ambient noise, carried words in both English and what sounded like Spanish, creating a bilingual lullaby that somehow transcended the language barriers that often divided the subway's international population. Several passengers found themselves listening, despite their attempts to maintain the studied indifference that served as armor against the city's emotional demands. The song reminded Samuel of Elena's own musical talents, the way she used to fill their home with piano melodies that danced off the stark white walls and breathed life into spaces that money could furnish, but only love could truly inhabit. He realized with a shock that he couldn't remember the last time he had listened to music for pleasure rather than as background noise designed to mask the silence of his solitude. Maya's simple lullaby carried more emotional impact than the sophisticated sound system in his penthouse had delivered in the 3 years since Elena's death. As the train approached Maya's stop, Samuel found himself moving closer to where she stood with her mother, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. The child looked up at him with those impossibly knowing eyes and smiled, not the practiced smile of someone seeking favor or advantage, but the kind of pure, uncomplicated expression of goodwill that Samuel hadn't experienced since he was a child himself. In that moment, something cracked in the ice that had formed around his heart. A hairline fracture that threatened to spread and shatter the careful emotional barriers he had constructed to protect himself from further loss. "I haven't believed in anything for a long time," Samuel heard himself saying, the words emerging from some deep place inside his chest that he hadn't accessed in years. His voice was rough with suppressed emotion, carrying the weight of grief and isolation that he had been carrying alone since Elena's death. The admission surprised him with its honesty and vulnerability, qualities that had no place in the boardrooms and conference calls that comprised his daily existence. Maya's response was immediate and startling in its simplicity. She didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances, didn't try to convince him that his pain was temporary or manageable. Instead, she simply said, "Sometimes God wears the face of a child," her words delivered with the matter-of-fact confidence that children brought to observations about the world around them. The statement hung in the air between them, neither religious sermon nor philosophical argument, but rather a gentle invitation to consider possibilities that Samuel's rational mind automatically rejected. The train pulled into the station, and Maya and her mother prepared to disembark, beginning their daily journey from the subway platform to the school where duty and economic necessity awaited. As they moved toward the doors, Maya turned back to look at Samuel one last time. She then reached into her small backpack and pulled out something that she pressed into his hand before following her mother onto the platform. The train doors closed before Samuel could examine what she had given him, but he felt the small object's weight in his palm like a seed of possibility planted in soil that had been barren for far too long. When Samuel finally looked at Maya's gift, he found himself holding a small wooden cross, rough-hewn and obviously handmade, painted with careful strokes of gold paint that caught the subway car's fluorescent lights and threw tiny reflections around the space. It wasn't valuable in any monetary sense. The materials probably cost less than the tip he left his barista each morning. Yet, as he closed his fingers around the simple carving, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, a flicker of warmth in the frozen landscape of his emotional life. That evening, for the first time since Elena's funeral, Samuel Pierce sat in his penthouse apartment and allowed himself to cry. The tears came slowly at first, then with increasing intensity, washing away layers of accumulated numbness and artificial control. He wept for Elena, of course, but also for himself, for the man he had become in his efforts to avoid the pain of living, for the years he had wasted hiding behind wealth and professional achievement, for the simple human connections he had sacrificed in pursuit of a security that had proven to be nothing more than an elaborate illusion. The wooden cross lay on his coffee table, a small presence in the vast expanse of his minimalist living room. It seemed to glow with its own light, though Samuel knew that was impossible. It was just paint and wood. shaped by hands that had probably learned their craft from necessity rather than artistic ambition. Yet somehow, this simple gift from a child who had every reason to hoard her few precious possessions had managed to illuminate corners of his soul that had been dark for far too long. Samuel Pierce, master of the universe in financial terms, had been given a treasure by someone who possessed nothing but managed to embody everything that wealth could never purchase. Hope, Samuel discovered, was a dangerous emotion for someone who had spent years perfecting the art of emotional numbness. Yet, as winter slowly gave way to spring, he found himself looking forward to his morning subway rides with an anticipation that had nothing to do with market analysis or business meetings. Maya's presence had become a fixed point in his daily routine, a reminder that the world contained possibilities that his carefully controlled existence had excluded. She didn't speak to him again directly, but her quiet acts of kindness continued to unfold around him like small miracles disguised as ordinary human decency. The changes in Samuel's life remained subtle at first, a softening of his expression when he looked at the photographs of Elena that he had kept hidden away, a gradual warming of his penthouse as he began opening curtains and allowing natural light to illuminate spaces that had been artificially darkened for years. The stopped clocks throughout his home began to tick again as he wound them one by one, accepting the passage of time as part of life's natural rhythm rather than an enemy to be defeated through force of will and financial power. But hope, as Samuel was about to learn, rarely arrives without its accompanying tests. The universe seemed determined to challenge his newfound openness to possibility, to force him to choose between the safe numbness of his previous existence and the uncertain but vibrant potential of a life lived in connection with others. Maya's mysterious gift had cracked open a door that Samuel thought had been permanently sealed, but whether he would have the courage to walk through that door remained to be seen. The morning of March 15th began like any other in Samuel's transformed routine. Spring had arrived early in New York City, bringing with it the kind of hopeful energy that made even the most cynical residents believe that change was possible. Samuel dressed with his usual precision, but now he picked up Maya's wooden cross from his nightstand and slipped it into his jacket pocket, a ritual that had become as essential as checking his phones for overnight market movements from international exchanges. The small carved symbol had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder that meaning could exist independent of monetary value. The subway platform was more crowded than usual, filled with tourists drawn to the city by the warming weather and New Yorkers emerging from winter's enforced hibernation. Samuel searched the familiar faces for Maya and her mother, expecting to see them in their usual position near the center of the platform. But as train after train arrived and departed, carrying its cargo of commuters toward their various destinations, there was no sign of the child who had somehow managed to restart his emotional life. At first, Samuel told himself that they had simply missed their regular train, or perhaps Maya was ill with one of the minor ailments that periodically afflicted children despite their mother's careful ministrations. But as minutes stretched into hours and his own business obligations forced him to abandon his vigil and report to his office, a familiar knot of anxiety began to form in his stomach. The absence felt profound in a way that defied rational explanation. After all, he barely knew this child, had spoken to her only once, understood nothing about her life beyond the brief glimpses afforded by their shared subway rides. The days that followed passed with agonizing slowness. Samuel found himself taking earlier and later trains, hoping to catch some sign of Maya and her mother, but the subway platform felt incomplete without their presence. The other commuters seemed somehow diminished, their daily struggles and small kindnesses overshadowed by the glaring absence of the child who had taught him to notice such things in the first place. His penthouse apartment, recently warmed by his growing emotional awakening, began to feel cold again, as if Maya's disappearance had somehow reversed the gradual healing that her presence had initiated. On the 5th day of Maya's absence, Samuel's personal assistant knocked on his office door with an expression that suggested something unusual had occurred. In her hands was an envelope that had been slipped under the door sometime during the night, with no indication of who had delivered it or how they had gained access to the heavily secured floor that housed Samuel's private offices. The envelope was made of cheap paper, the kind available at any corner store, and bore no return address or identifying marks except for a crude drawing of a subway car filled with smiling stick figures. Samuel opened the envelope with trembling fingers, his heart pounding with an intensity that reminded him uncomfortably of the anxiety attacks he had experienced in the months following Elena's death. Inside was a single sheet of paper, obviously torn from a child's notebook, with words written in the careful block letters that suggested someone still learning to master the complex relationship between thought and written expression. The message was simple, almost primitive in its directness: trust the light inside. Beneath the words was a drawing that took Samuel several moments to decipher. It appeared to show a man in a suit. The figure was crude but recognizable as representing someone of business or professional standing next to a small girl whose hand was extended toward him. Around them were other figures, equally simple but somehow radiating warmth and connection despite the limitations of a child's artistic abilities. At the bottom of the page, tucked into a corner like an afterthought, was a small doodle that Samuel recognized as representing the wooden cross that Maya had given him, the same cross that now rested in his jacket pocket like a secret prayer. Along with the drawing was something that made Samuel's breath catch in his throat. Wrapped in a small piece of tissue paper was the mate to the wooden cross he carried, another rough-carved symbol, this one unpainted, but bearing the same careful attention to detail that marked it as the work of loving hands working with simple materials. The wood was warm to the touch, as if it had recently been held by someone whose body temperature had somehow been transferred to the carved surface. Samuel sat in his leather chair, surrounded by the technological marvels and financial instruments that represented decades of accumulated wealth and professional achievement, holding a piece of carved wood that had probably cost pennies to create. Yet the simple gift carried more emotional weight than all the expensive art and luxury items that filled his various homes. It was a message from someone who had recognized his spiritual poverty despite his material abundance, an offering of hope from a child who had every reason to hoard whatever small treasures life had provided. That evening, Samuel made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Instead of returning to his penthouse for another night of isolated contemplation, he took the subway to Queens, following the route he had memorized from watching Maya and her mother make their daily journey. The neighborhoods grew progressively less affluent as the train carried him further from Manhattan's financial towers, but Samuel found himself noticing details that his previous life of luxury had obscured. The way evening light fell across apartment buildings that housed entire communities, the sound of children playing in small parks sandwiched between busy streets, the sense of cooking food that spoke of families gathering around dinner tables to share both meals and conversation. Finding Maya's specific address required detective work that Samuel's usual resources couldn't provide. He couldn't simply hire investigators or use his financial connections to locate a child whose last name he didn't know. Instead, he was forced to rely on the same basic human interactions that most people took for granted, asking questions, following leads, accepting help from strangers who had no reason to assist him beyond basic human kindness. The experience was both humbling and educational for someone accustomed to having his every need anticipated and fulfilled by paid staff. When Samuel finally found the apartment building where Maya lived with her mother, he discovered a world that existed parallel to his own, but operated according to entirely different rules and values. The building was old but well-maintained, its brick facade bearing the patina of decades spent housing working families who took pride in their small spaces despite economic limitations. Children played in the courtyard, their voices echoing off the surrounding walls with the kind of joyful noise that Samuel's soundproofed penthouse had never contained. Elderly residents sat on stoops and balconies, watching the evening unfold with the patient satisfaction of people who had learned to find contentment in simple pleasures. The discovery of Maya's illness came through a conversation with a neighbor who recognized concern in Samuel's carefully worded inquiries about the little girl and her mother. Maya had been hospitalized with pneumonia, a condition that would be easily treatable for someone with access to premium health care, but potentially serious for a family dependent on public assistance and clinic appointments scheduled weeks in advance. Her mother was spending every possible moment at the hospital, traveling back and forth on buses and subways while trying to maintain her job at the school and manage the mounting expenses that accompanied even routine medical care. Samuel's first instinct was to solve the problem the way he solved everything, with money. His wealth could easily cover any medical expenses, could guarantee Maya access to the finest specialists in private rooms that would make her recovery as comfortable as possible. But something about the wooden cross in his pocket, about the simple message to trust the light inside, suggested that this situation required something more complex than financial intervention. Maya had given him a gift that transcended monetary value, and his response needed to honor the spirit of that generosity rather than simply overwhelming it with superior economic force. The solution, when it came to Samuel, was as simple as Maya's own approach to kindness, direct, uncomplicated, and focused on immediate human need rather than grand gestures or complex strategies. He would visit Maya in the hospital, not as a wealthy benefactor distributing charity, but as someone whose life had been touched by her quiet faith and gentle wisdom. He would offer what she had given him, presence, attention, and the kind of care that didn't depend on financial resources, but flowed from genuine human connection. The children's ward of the public hospital was a world away from the private medical facilities that Samuel had used during Elena's illness. The walls were painted in cheerful colors that couldn't quite mask the underlying institutional atmosphere, and the air carried the scent of disinfectant mixed with the particular sadness that seemed to permeate places where young lives hung in the balance. Yet, despite the obvious limitations of resources and funding, the dedication of the medical staff was evident in every interaction. Their commitment to their small patients transcending whatever limitations their working conditions might impose. Samuel found Maya in a room she shared with 3 other children, her small form nearly lost among the medical equipment that monitored and supported her recovery. She was awake when he entered, her large dark eyes immediately recognizing him despite the unexpected context of their meeting. Her mother sat beside the bed, holding her daughter's hand with the fierce protectiveness that Samuel had observed during their subway encounters, but now shadowed with the exhaustion and worry that came with watching a child struggle against illness. "You came," Maya whispered, her voice hoarse from the respiratory condition that had brought her to this sterile room, but still carrying the same gentle authority that had commanded a subway car full of adults to step back from danger. There was no surprise in her tone, as if she had somehow known that the wealthy stranger she had befriended during their brief subway encounters would eventually find his way to her bedside when she needed him most. Samuel pulled a chair close to Maya's bed, carefully avoiding the medical tubes and wires that connected her small body to the machinery keeping track of her vital signs. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital room, with her hair matted from fever and her usually bright eyes dimmed by medication and fatigue, Maya looked even smaller and more vulnerable than she had in the subway car. Yet somehow, her presence still radiated the same quiet strength that had first captured Samuel's attention, the same unshakable faith that had convinced a crowded train car to trust the warnings of a child. "I brought you something," Samuel said quietly, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw the unpainted wooden cross that had accompanied Maya's note. He placed it gently on her bedside table, next to a collection of get-well cards, obviously made by her classmates, and a small stuffed animal that bore the signs of years of loving attention. The simple carved symbol looked at home among these humble treasures, adding its quiet presence to the collection of objects that represented love offered without expectation of return. Maya's smile when it came, was worth more to Samuel than any successful business deal or profitable investment strategy had ever been. It was the smile of someone who had been seen and recognized, whose simple gift had been received with the respect it deserved. She reached out with fingers made clumsy by IV tubing and touched the wooden cross, her expression suggesting that she understood the significance of its return, not as rejection of her offering, but as completion of a circle that had begun months earlier on a crowded subway platform. "I knew you would keep it safe," Maya said, her words carrying the certainty of someone whose faith had never been disappointed, despite living in circumstances that might have justified cynicism or despair. Her statement wasn't about the wooden cross itself, but about something much more valuable and fragile: the connection between two souls who had found each other across the barriers of age, class, and circumstance, united by their mutual recognition of love's persistence in a world that often seemed designed to crush such tender possibilities. Samuel spent the rest of the evening sitting beside Maya's hospital bed, listening to her stories about school and friends and dreams that had nothing to do with money or professional success. Her mother gradually relaxed as she realized that this wealthy stranger posed no threat to her daughter, gradually warmed as she witnessed the gentle reverence with which Samuel treated Maya's simple wisdom. As the hospital machinery hummed softly in the background and evening shadows lengthened across the cheerful walls, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced since Elena's death: the profound peace that came from being exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what his heart demanded. The miracle, Samuel realized later, wasn't that Maya recovered from her pneumonia. Modern medicine and careful nursing would have ensured that outcome eventually, regardless of any divine intervention. The miracle was that a wealthy man had learned to see beyond the surface of things, to recognize value that couldn't be measured in dollars or market performance. Maya had given him more than a wooden cross and a child's drawing. She had returned to him his capacity for wonder, his ability to believe that love could transcend circumstances, and that faith could exist independent of evidence or logical proof. When Maya was finally released from the hospital, Samuel was there to drive her and her mother home, his luxury sedan filled with balloons and flowers that brought color and joy to the usually somber space. The ride through Queens was different than any journey he had ever taken, not because of the destination, but because of the passengers. Maya sat in the back seat, chattering excitedly about returning to school and seeing her friends, while her mother sat beside Samuel in the front seat, no longer wary of his intentions, but grateful for his genuine care for her daughter. The transformation that had begun months earlier on a subway platform was now complete, though Samuel wouldn't fully understand its magnitude until much later. The man who had mocked a child's warnings about invisible danger had become someone who could see miracles hidden in everyday kindness. The financier who had reduced all human interaction to calculations of profit and loss had learned to value connection that couldn't be quantified or controlled. The widower who had stopped his clocks to avoid confronting the passage of time had begun to understand that love didn't end with death, but continued to flow through every act of compassion and grace. As Samuel watched Maya run toward her apartment building, her energy and joy fully restored, he felt Elena's presence more strongly than he had since her death. Not as a ghost haunting his memory, but as a continuing force for good in the world, manifesting through his willingness to open his heart to a child who had needed nothing from him except recognition of her worth. The wooden cross in his pocket felt warm against his hand, a reminder that some gifts could only be received by those who had learned to see with their hearts rather than their eyes. The events of that spring morning 6 months later would be reported in newspapers as a mechanical failure narrowly averted, a story of quick thinking by subway personnel and the kind of close call that reminded New Yorkers to appreciate the complex systems that moved millions of people safely through the city's underground arteries every day. But for Samuel Pierce, standing in a crowded subway car as Maya's voice again cut through the chaos with warnings that adults had learned to heed, it was something much more profound. It was proof that love could indeed work miracles, and that faith could move more than mountains. The train approaching the Times Square platform on this particular morning was carrying more passengers than usual, the result of earlier delays that had compressed the normal flow of commuters into a smaller window of time. Samuel noticed the unusual density of bodies in the car, the way people pressed together with the resigned tolerance that New Yorkers displayed when the city's infrastructure demanded extra patience and flexibility. He had positioned himself near Maya and her mother, having learned months earlier that their presence made even the most crowded conditions bearable. Maya stood quietly beside her mother, her small hand tucked safely in the older woman's grasp, but Samuel could see the tension beginning to build in her posture. Her eyes darted around the car with increasing frequency, and her grip on her mother's hand tightened until her knuckles showed white against her brown skin. The same focused intensity that Samuel had learned to recognize and respect was building behind her dark eyes, the same otherworldly awareness that had first captured his attention and ultimately changed his life. The train's approach to the station felt different somehow, faster, more urgent, carrying a mechanical energy that seemed to press against the windows and vibrate through the floor beneath their feet. Samuel's years of experience reading market fluctuations and analyzing subtle changes in complex systems had trained him to notice variations in familiar patterns, and something about this morning's ride struck him as fundamentally wrong. Yet the other passengers seemed oblivious to any danger, lost in their smartphones and private thoughts, trusting in systems they didn't understand to deliver them safely to their destinations. Maya's voice, when it finally rose above the ambient noise, carried all the authority and urgency that Samuel remembered from their first encounter months earlier. But this time, instead of dismissing her words as childish nonsense, the entire car seemed to respond with the kind of instant obedience that suggested collective recognition of genuine threat. "Everyone back!" she called out, her young voice cutting through the mechanical noise like a blade through silk. "Back from the doors now!" The response was immediate and universal. Passengers who had been crowding toward the exits suddenly stepped away from the doors, pressing together in the center of the car with the confused but complete compliance of people who had learned to trust their instincts, even when their rational minds couldn't explain their actions. Samuel found himself pushing backward with the rest, his expensive suit rubbing against the worn coats and jackets of working people whose lives had intersected with his through circumstances that still felt miraculous despite their growing familiarity. The train's emergency braking system engaged with a sound, like the world tearing itself apart, metal grinding against metal in a symphony of controlled destruction that filled the subway tunnel with echoes and sparks. The car lurched forward, then backward, throwing passengers against each other in a brief moment of chaos that could have been tragic, but instead became testimony to the power of collective trust in something beyond rational understanding. The screeching of brakes filled every available space with noise that seemed to come from the earth itself, a mechanical scream that drowned out individual voices and reduced the complex urban environment to its most basic elements. When the train finally came to rest, still on the tracks but mere inches from a catastrophic derailment that would have made headlines around the world, the silence that followed felt almost sacred. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat, the rapid breathing of his fellow passengers, the small sounds of people checking themselves for injury and finding instead the profound relief that came with unexpected salvation. The subway car that might have become a metal coffin had instead become a sanctuary, protected by forces that no amount of engineering or safety regulation could have provided. Maya stood in the center of the car, her small form somehow commanding the attention of every adult around her, despite her obvious youth and humble circumstances. Her face showed no triumph or satisfaction at having her warnings heeded, no childish pride in being proven right about dangers that older and supposedly wiser people had failed to recognize. Instead, she looked around the car with the same gentle compassion that had first drawn Samuel's attention, checking on her fellow passengers with the instinctive care of someone whose primary concern was always the welfare of others. Samuel felt tears streaming down his face, Not tears of fear or relief at having avoided physical harm, but tears of profound gratitude for the gift of witnessing love in action. Maya's warnings hadn't been about demonstrating her special knowledge or seeking attention for her unusual abilities. They had been about protecting people she cared about, extending her circle of concern to include strangers who shared nothing with her except their common humanity and their morning commute through the underground arteries of New York City. As emergency personnel arrived and began the process of evacuating the damaged train, Samuel found himself standing next to Maya and her mother in the growing crowd of displaced commuters. The three of them had become bound together by something stronger than blood relations or financial contracts. They were connected by their shared experience of mercy, their mutual recognition that life contained possibilities that transcended rational explanation or scientific analysis. "Thank you," Samuel whispered to Maya, his voice barely audible above the noise of rescue operations and passenger conversations. The words felt inadequate to express what he was feeling, gratitude not just for physical safety, but for the gift of restored faith, for the reminder that the universe still contained mysteries that money couldn't solve and education couldn't explain. Maya looked up at him with those impossibly knowing eyes and smiled, her expression suggesting that thanks were unnecessary because love given freely never expected anything in return. The newspaper accounts of the near disaster would focus on mechanical failures and the quick response of transportation officials, treating the incident as another example of the complex challenges involved in moving millions of people through aging infrastructure. But Samuel knew that the real story could never be told in newspaper columns or official reports. The real story was about a child whose faith had moved mountains, whose love had created miracles, whose simple warnings had saved lives because adults had finally learned to listen with their hearts rather than their heads. As Samuel walked through the streets of Manhattan that morning, his commute forever changed by events that would live in his memory until his dying day, he felt Elena's presence surrounding him like a warm embrace. She had always believed that love was the most powerful force in the universe, that kindness could work wonders that reason alone could never achieve. Through Maya's example, Samuel had finally learned to see the world through Elena's eyes, to understand that wealth and professional success were meaningless unless they served the larger purpose of connecting souls and creating the conditions in which love could flourish. The wooden cross in his pocket felt warm against his hand as Samuel made his way toward his office building, but his mind was no longer focused on market reports or investment strategies. Instead, he was thinking about children who needed protection, families who deserved the same kind of miracle that had transformed his own life, communities where tiny voices like Maya's could be heard and heeded before disaster struck. Samuel Pierce had been saved by love disguised as a child's warning, and now it was his turn to ensure that other souls in need of salvation might find their own messengers from heaven. The transformation of Samuel Pierce didn't happen overnight, though the seeds of change had been planted months earlier in a crowded subway car beneath the streets of Manhattan. In the weeks following the near disaster that had been averted by Maya's mysterious warnings, Samuel found himself experiencing a restlessness that no amount of financial success could satisfy. His penthouse apartment, once a sanctuary of controlled perfection, now felt like a museum dedicated to a life he no longer wanted to live. The silence that had previously provided refuge from the emotional demands of human connection now pressed against his consciousness like a weight demanding to be lifted. The first significant change came when Samuel decided to liquidate a substantial portion of his investment portfolio, not because of market conditions or strategic considerations, but because he had finally found a purpose for his accumulated wealth that transcended personal security or status. The millions of dollars that had once represented his scorecard in competition with other financial titans now became seed money for something entirely different, a foundation dedicated to protecting and nurturing the kind of vulnerable children who possessed wisdom beyond their years, but lacked the resources to make their voices heard. The Pierce Foundation for Child Advocacy was established with a mission statement that would have seemed impossibly naive to the man Samuel had been just a year earlier: to create spaces where young voices can be heard, trusted, and empowered to create positive change in their communities. The language was simple, almost elementary in its directness, but Samuel had learned from Maya that the most profound truths were often expressed in the most uncomplicated terms. Complex financial instruments and elaborate legal structures were tools for adults who had forgotten how to communicate with the directness of children. Samuel's first major initiative involved partnering with New York City's public school system to create wisdom councils, forums where children could express concerns about safety, report problems that adults had missed, and propose solutions to challenges affecting their schools and neighborhoods. The concept was met with skepticism from education officials who questioned whether children possessed the judgment necessary to contribute meaningfully to policy decisions. But Samuel had learned to trust in possibilities that couldn't be measured by conventional standards, and he used his wealth not to override objections, but to fund pilot programs that would allow results to speak louder than theories. The success of the Wisdom Councils exceeded even Samuel's optimistic projections. Children who had been dismissed as troublemakers revealed themselves to be clear-eyed observers of their environment, capable of identifying problems and proposing solutions that adult administrators had overlooked. Students reported safety hazards that prevented accidents, suggested schedule changes that improved academic performance, and created conflict resolution systems that reduced violence and increased cooperation. Most importantly, the councils gave children like Maya a forum where their unusual insights could be shared and implemented rather than dismissed as childish imagination. Samuel's personal transformation was reflected in changes to his living situation that would have been unthinkable during his years of grief-driven isolation. The cold perfection of his penthouse gave way to a warm, lived-in space filled with the sounds and colors that children brought wherever they went. Maya and her mother became frequent visitors, joining Samuel for dinners that featured simple foods prepared with care, rather than expensive ingredients designed to impress. The stopped clocks throughout his home were replaced with timepieces that chimed the hours, marking time's passage as a celebration rather than a threat. The mansion in the Hamptons, once a monument to Samuel's success in Elena's memory, was converted into a summer camp for children from low-income families, kids who might never have experienced the peace and beauty of natural settings without the kind of intervention that wealth could provide. The camp operated on principles that Maya had taught Samuel through her example: that every child possessed inherent wisdom that deserved respect, that love offered freely created miracles beyond rational explanation, that faith could move mountains when it was expressed through practical action. Samuel's transformation extended beyond philanthropic activities into the realm of personal relationships that he had avoided since Elena's death. The fear of loss that had driven him into emotional isolation gradually gave way to an understanding that love shared was love multiplied. That connection with others was the only true antidote to the mortality that had terrified him since his wife's illness. Maya's presence in his life served as a bridge between the love he had lost and the love he could still give, proof that hearts broken by grief could be healed through service to others. The child whose warnings had quite literally saved lives became Samuel's unofficial advisor on matters that his business education had never addressed. Maya possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that complemented his analytical skills, helping him identify opportunities for meaningful intervention in the lives of children who needed advocates and protectors. Her mother, initially suspicious of Samuel's motives, gradually became a trusted partner in his philanthropic efforts, her practical wisdom balancing his generous impulses with realistic assessments of what could actually be accomplished. As Samuel's foundation grew and evolved, attracting attention from other wealthy individuals who had been searching for meaningful ways to use their resources, He began to understand that his experience with Maya represented something larger than a personal transformation. Across the country, there were other children whose voices needed to be heard, other adults whose hearts had been frozen by loss or disappointment, other communities where the wisdom of the young could provide solutions that the expertise of adults had missed. The annual gala for the Pierce Foundation became one of New York's most sought-after charity events, attracting celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who contributed millions of dollars to support programs that gave children a voice in decisions affecting their lives. But Samuel's favorite part of these elaborate fundraising events was always the moment when children from the Wisdom Councils took the stage to share their stories and insights. Their simple, direct presentations consistently moved audiences to tears and reminded sophisticated adults of truths they had forgotten in their pursuit of success and status. Maya, now 9 years old and even more articulate than she had been during their subway encounters, became a frequent speaker at foundation events. Her presentations never focused on her role in saving Samuel's life or preventing the subway disaster that could have claimed multiple victims. Instead, she spoke about the importance of listening to children, of trusting young people's instincts about their environment, of creating communities where wisdom could flow in all directions rather than simply from old to young. The relationship between Samuel and Maya evolved as she grew older, shifting from patron and beneficiary to genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting vulnerable children. Samuel discovered that Maya's mysterious ability to sense danger was just one manifestation of a broader emotional intelligence that allowed her to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. She became his informal consultant on foundation decisions, helping him identify which programs truly served children's needs and which initiatives merely satisfied adult assumptions about what young people required. Samuel's health, which had deteriorated during his years of grief and isolation, improved dramatically as his sense of purpose was restored. The chronic insomnia that had plagued him since Elena's death disappeared when his days became filled with meaningful activity rather than empty routine. His blood pressure normalized as stress was replaced by the kind of productive challenge that his mind and body craved. Most importantly, the depression that had shadowed his existence lifted as he reconnected with the joy that came from using his abilities in service of something larger than personal advancement. The wooden cross that Maya had given him during their first conversation remained in Samuel's jacket pocket, a reminder of the moment when his transformation had begun. Over time, it had become smooth from handling, its rough edges worn away by constant contact with his fingers during moments of decision or contemplation. The simple carved symbol served as a touchstone connecting him to the faith that had saved his life, not religious faith in any conventional sense, but faith in the possibility that love could triumph over despair, that wisdom could emerge from unexpected sources, that miracles could manifest through ordinary human kindness. As Samuel approached his 50th birthday, he found himself reflecting on the man he had become versus the man he had been before Maya entered his life. The change was so profound that his former self seemed like a different person entirely, someone he barely recognized despite sharing the same memories and experiences. The calculating financier who had mocked a child's warnings had been replaced by someone who understood that the most valuable investments couldn't be measured in dollars or market performance, but in the impacts they had on human lives and communities. The Foundation's work expanded beyond New York City to include programs in other major urban areas where children's voices needed amplification and protection. Samuel's wealth, once focused on accumulating assets for their own sake, now flowed toward initiatives that created lasting change in the lives of young people who might otherwise have been overlooked or silenced. Each program was designed with Maya's example in mind, focusing not on what adults thought children needed, but on creating space for young people to express their own vision of what their communities could become. Samuel's relationship with Maya's mother had deepened over the years into something resembling family bonds, though neither of them attempted to define or formalize their connection. She had become his closest advisor on matters involving children and families, her practical experience balancing his idealistic impulses with realistic assessments of what could actually be achieved. Her initial skepticism about wealthy people's motives had given way to genuine friendship, based on shared commitment to Maya's welfare and the broader goal of creating a world where children's wisdom was valued and protected. The anniversary of Elena's death, once a day of paralyzing grief that Samuel dreaded for weeks in advance, had transformed into an occasion for celebration of love's continuing presence in the world. Samuel spent this day each year visiting the children's programs that the foundation supported, sharing stories about Elena with young people who had never met her, but understood instinctively that her spirit lived on through acts of kindness and protection. Maya always joined him for these memorial visits, her presence serving as a bridge between the love he had lost and the love he had found through service to others. As Samuel looked toward the future, he saw possibilities that would have been unimaginable during his years of grief-driven isolation. The foundation had grown large enough to influence policy at municipal and state levels, advocating for systematic changes that would give children's voices more weight in decisions affecting their lives. Educational institutions were beginning to recognize that wisdom flowed in multiple directions, that young people often possessed insights that adult expertise missed, that communities functioned best when all voices were heard and respected. The subway system where Samuel had first encountered Maya had installed new safety protocols partially inspired by the near disaster that her warnings had prevented. The changes were subtle: improved communication systems, enhanced training for conductors, better maintenance schedules for aging infrastructure. But they represented acknowledgement that intuitive warnings deserved serious attention even when they came from unexpected sources. Samuel took quiet satisfaction in knowing that Maya's remarkable gift had contributed to systemic improvements that would protect countless future passengers. The man who had once measured his worth in terms of accumulated assets now found meaning in a different kind of calculation: the number of children who felt heard and valued because of programs the foundation supported, the quantity of young voices that had influenced positive changes in their communities, the accumulating evidence that wisdom could emerge from sources that conventional thinking might overlook. These metrics couldn't be tracked in spreadsheets or financial statements, but they represented a form of wealth that sustained Samuel's spirit in ways that money alone never could. Samuel Pierce's story had become legendary within philanthropic circles, though he insisted that credit belonged to Maya rather than himself. He spoke frequently at conferences and fundraising events, but always focused his presentations on the children whose wisdom had guided the foundation's work rather than on his own transformation from cynical financier to passionate advocate. His testimony carried particular weight because his conversion had been so dramatic and his previous skepticism so well documented among his former colleagues in the financial industry. The evening light streaming through Samuel's apartment windows now illuminated walls covered with children's artwork, photographs from foundation events, and letters from young people whose lives had been touched by programs that Maya's example had inspired. The sterile perfection of his former living space had given way to the beautiful chaos that resulted from life lived in connection with others. The silence that had once protected him from emotional pain had been replaced by sounds of laughter, conversation, and the kind of purposeful activity that filled days with meaning rather than mere accomplishment. As Samuel sat in his favorite chair, watching the sunset over Manhattan's skyline while Maya worked quietly on her homework at his kitchen table, he felt Elena's presence as a continuing blessing rather than a haunting memory. His wife would have loved Maya immediately, would have recognized in the child's gentle wisdom the same qualities that had drawn Samuel to Elena years earlier. The love that death had interrupted had found new expression through his commitment to protecting and nurturing the kind of vulnerable innocence that Maya represented. The wooden cross in Samuel's pocket caught the evening light as he shifted in his chair, its smooth surface warm from years of handling and worn soft by constant contact with his fingers during moments of decision or contemplation. The simple carved symbol had become more than a reminder of Maya's gift. It had evolved into a representation of faith restored, hope renewed, and love discovered in forms he had never expected. Samuel Pierce had been saved by a child's warning, but his salvation had required his willingness to hear truth spoken by someone society usually ignored. The years following Samuel's dramatic transformation were marked not by grand gestures or headline-making events, but by the steady accumulation of small acts of kindness and wisdom that gradually changed the landscape of children's advocacy in New York City and beyond. The Pierce Foundation had grown from Samuel's personal quest for meaning into a nationally recognized organization that influenced policy at multiple levels while never losing sight of its core mission, ensuring that children's voices were heard, trusted, and empowered to create positive change. Maya, now in her early teens, had evolved from the mysterious child whose subway warnings had saved lives into a confident young woman whose insights continued to guide the Foundation's work. Her unusual ability to sense danger remained intact, but it had been joined by a more conventional form of leadership that manifested through her work with peer counseling programs, safety initiatives in schools, and advocacy efforts that gave other children platforms for expressing their concerns and solutions. The relationship between Samuel and Maya's family had deepened over time into bonds that transcended traditional categories of friendship or mentorship. Maya's mother had become Samuel's closest advisor on all matters involving children and families, her practical wisdom serving as a constant check on his philanthropic impulses, while her unwavering support encouraged him to dream bigger and reach further. Their weekly dinners had become sacred time for planning Foundation initiatives, sharing stories about program successes, and maintaining the personal connections that kept their work grounded in human relationships rather than abstract charitable goals. Samuel's personal living space reflected the ongoing nature of his transformation from isolated widower to engaged community member. His apartment had become an informal headquarters for Foundation activities, with bedrooms converted to offices where staff could work on program development, and his dining room regularly hosting planning sessions with children and adults, working together on initiatives that affected entire neighborhoods. The cold perfection of his former lifestyle had been replaced by the warm chaos that resulted from life lived in service to others. The annual Day of Remembrance, established to honor Elena's memory while celebrating the ongoing work of the Foundation, had become one of New York's most moving charitable events. Unlike typical fundraising galas focused on entertaining wealthy donors, this gathering centered on testimony from children whose lives had been changed by Foundation programs, adults who had learned to listen more carefully to young voices, and communities that had been strengthened by initiatives that took children's wisdom seriously. Maya always spoke at these events, her presentations evolving over the years from simple expressions of gratitude to sophisticated analyses of how society could better protect and empower its youngest members. Samuel's approach to wealth management had been revolutionized by his growing understanding that money was merely a tool for creating conditions where love could flourish. His investment strategy now focused on companies and initiatives that aligned with Foundation values, choosing long-term social impact over short-term financial returns. This approach had proven surprisingly profitable, as businesses that genuinely cared about their communities and employees tended to outperform purely profit-driven competitors over time. Samuel had discovered that doing good and doing well were not mutually exclusive goals. They were natural partners when approached with integrity and long-term vision. The subway system where Samuel had first encountered Maya had become something of a pilgrimage site for Foundation supporters, though Samuel discouraged the kind of mystical thinking that might treat the location as inherently sacred. The real miracle, he insisted, was not that a child had possessed supernatural knowledge about impending danger, but that adults had learned to trust young people's instincts and insights about their environment. The Foundation's transportation safety programs had been instrumental in preventing numerous accidents and improving communication between transit workers and passengers of all ages. Maya's educational journey had been carefully planned to nurture her unique gifts while providing her with the conventional academic credentials that would allow her to pursue whatever career path appealed to her as she matured. Samuel had established a scholarship fund to ensure that Maya and children like her could access the best educational opportunities available, but he was careful never to impose his own expectations or assumptions about what constituted success. The Foundation's educational initiatives focused on creating space for children to develop their natural talents and interests, rather than forcing them into predetermined molds. The most rewarding aspect of Samuel's transformed life was watching Maya grow into her role as a bridge between adult and youth perspectives on community challenges. Her ability to translate children's concerns into language that adults could understand, while simultaneously helping young people appreciate the constraints and complexities that shaped adult decision-making, made her an invaluable mediator in situations where generational conflicts threatened to derail positive change. She had become proof that wisdom could flow in all directions when people approached each other with respect and genuine curiosity about different perspectives. Samuel's health continued to improve as his sense of purpose deepened and his connections with others strengthened. The cardiac issues that had developed during his years of grief and isolation had resolved completely. His blood pressure had normalized and his energy levels had returned to those of a much younger man. His physician attributed these improvements to reduced stress and increased physical activity, but Samuel knew that the real healing agent had been the restoration of meaning and connection to his daily existence. He had learned that hearts could literally be mended through love given and received. The Foundation's influence had expanded beyond direct service programs to include research initiatives that documented the unique perspectives children brought to community problem solving. Academic studies funded by Pierce Foundation grants had provided empirical evidence that children often identified safety hazards, social problems, and innovative solutions that trained professionals missed. This research was gradually changing how schools, social service agencies, and municipal governments approached community engagement, with increasing recognition that effective policy required input from all affected populations regardless of age. Samuel's relationship with Maya's extended family had grown to encompass a network of relatives and friends who had become his chosen community. Sunday dinners at Maya's apartment building often included grandparents, aunts, uncles, and neighbors who had initially been skeptical of the wealthy man's interest in their community, but had gradually accepted him as someone whose commitment was genuine and whose presence enhanced rather than disrupted their established relationships. These gatherings provided Samuel with insights into family dynamics and community values that his privileged background had never allowed him to experience firsthand. The international expansion of Pierce Foundation programs had brought Samuel and Maya to countries where children faced challenges that made American urban problems seem manageable by comparison. These trips had deepened their mutual understanding of how privilege and poverty operated on global scales, while reinforcing their shared commitment to creating conditions where young voices could influence decisions that affected their communities. Maya's ability to connect with children across cultural and linguistic barriers had proven as remarkable as her original gift for sensing danger, suggesting that her talents were rooted in something deeper than supernatural abilities. Samuel's speaking engagements at conferences and universities now focused on the practical lessons he had learned about listening to children, rather than on the dramatic circumstances of his personal transformation. He had developed presentation skills that could convince skeptical audiences that taking children seriously was not merely a moral imperative, but a practical strategy for solving complex social problems. His testimony carried particular weight because his conversion from cynicism to advocacy had been so thoroughly documented, and because the Foundation's programs had produced measurable results that validated his claims about children's wisdom. The Pierce Foundation's annual report had become required reading for professionals working in child advocacy, education, and community development. Unlike typical nonprofit publications focused on fundraising appeals, these documents contain detailed analyses of program outcomes, theoretical frameworks for understanding children's roles in community problem-solving, and practical guidelines for implementing initiatives that empowered young voices. Samuel insisted on transparency about both successes and failures, believing that honest assessment was essential for continuous improvement and credible advocacy. Maya's role in Foundation operations had evolved from inspiring example to active partner in program development and implementation. Her teenage years were spent balancing regular academic responsibilities with increasing involvement in Foundation activities that drew on her unique combination of intuitive gifts and developing analytical skills. She had become particularly effective at training adults to listen more carefully to children, helping professionals overcome their unconscious biases about age and wisdom while respecting legitimate concerns about child protection and development. The memorial garden established in Elena's honor on the Foundation's headquarters roof had become a gathering place where children and adults could find quiet space for reflection and conversation. Maya had designed much of the garden layout, choosing plants and design elements that created an environment where people could feel both sheltered and connected to the larger urban landscape surrounding them. The space served as a reminder that growth and beauty could emerge from loss, and that love continued to nurture new life even after death. As Samuel approached his 52nd birthday, he found himself reflecting not on what he had lost, but on what he had gained through his willingness to trust in possibilities that his former worldview had rejected. The man who had once measured his worth entirely in terms of accumulated assets now understood that true wealth consisted of relationships, purpose, and the capacity to contribute to something larger than personal advancement. Maya's gift had been more than warning about physical danger. She had offered him salvation from a spiritual poverty that threatened to destroy everything that made life worth living. The wooden cross that Maya had given him years earlier remained in Samuel's jacket pocket, its surface worn smooth by constant handling, and its meaning deepened by accumulated experiences of faith, validated through practical results. The simple carved symbol served as a reminder that the most profound truths were often expressed through the most humble messenger, that wisdom could emerge from sources that conventional thinking overlooked, and that love offered freely could create miracles that transcended rational explanation. Samuel Pierce had been saved by a child's warning, but his salvation had required his willingness to hear truth spoken by someone the world usually ignored. In learning to listen to Maya, he had discovered how to listen to Elena's continuing presence in his life, how to honor her memory through service to others, and how to live with hope rather than merely exist with accumulated regrets. The subway platform where their story had begun remained a symbol not of miraculous intervention, but of love's persistence in a world that often seemed designed to crush such tender possibilities. The morning light, filtering through Samuel's apartment windows, now illuminated a space filled with evidence of life lived in connection with others. Photographs from Foundation events, artwork created by children whose lives had been touched by programs Maya had inspired, letters from families whose voices had been amplified by initiatives that took children's wisdom seriously. The silence that had once protected him from emotional pain had been replaced by sounds of purpose, community, and the beautiful chaos that resulted from hearts open to love in all its unexpected forms. On a crisp October morning, exactly 5 years after Maya's voice had first commanded a subway car to step back from danger, Samuel Pierce sat on a bench in Central Park watching children play with the kind of fearless joy that had once seemed foreign to his carefully controlled existence. Maya, now a poised teenager whose wisdom continued to astound adults while her laughter reminded everyone that she was still fundamentally a child, sat beside him reviewing applications for the Foundation's newest initiative, a program designed to train children as community safety observers whose insights could prevent accidents and identify hazards that adult oversight might miss. The park bench where they sat had become their unofficial office for conversations too important for formal meeting rooms, a place where the boundary between mentor and student, benefactor and beneficiary, adult and child, could dissolve into the kind of authentic relationship that transcended conventional categories. The October air carried hints of coming winter, but Samuel felt only warmth as he watched Maya's careful consideration of each application, her attention to both the practical qualifications and the intangible qualities that might indicate a child's readiness to serve others through enhanced observation and communication. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't trusted me that first day?" Maya asked, her question emerging from the comfortable silence they often shared when working together. Her tone was curious rather than accusatory, reflecting genuine interest in the alternative pathways their lives might have taken, rather than any need for validation of her role in Samuel's transformation. Samuel considered the question carefully, his mind traveling back to the man he had been before Maya's warnings had cracked open his frozen heart. "I think I would have remained exactly as I was," he said finally, his honesty reflecting the self-awareness that had developed through years of reflection and growth. "Wealthy, successful, and completely cut off from everything that makes life meaningful. You didn't just save lives that day on the subway. You saved souls." Maya nodded thoughtfully, her mature response to his words, indicating how much she had grown since their first encounter. "My mother says that sometimes we meet people exactly when we need them most, even if we don't recognize it at the time. She thinks it wasn't an accident that we were on the same train that morning." The mention of Maya's mother brought a smile to Samuel's face, as her wisdom and practical guidance had become essential elements in his life over the past 5 years. Her initial skepticism about his motives had evolved into a partnership that balanced his idealistic impulses with realistic assessments of what could actually be achieved. She had taught him that sustainable change required patience, persistence, and deep respect for the communities being served, lessons that had shaped every aspect of the Foundation's work. As they prepared to leave the park and return to their respective responsibilities, Maya to her afternoon classes, Samuel to a board meeting where Foundation members would review proposals for expanding programs to other cities, Samuel felt the familiar weight of the wooden cross in his jacket pocket. The simple carved symbol had become more than a reminder of Maya's gift. It had evolved into a representation of faith restored, purpose discovered, and love found in forms he had never expected to encounter. "Maya," Samuel said as they stood to gather their papers and head back toward the subway station that had been the site of their first meeting, "I want you to know that whatever path your life takes, whatever you choose to do with your remarkable gifts, you've already accomplished something miraculous. You've shown that one person's courage to speak truth, no matter how young or seemingly powerless, can change everything for those who learn to listen." Maya's response came in the form of a hug that conveyed more gratitude and affection than words could express, a gesture that reminded Samuel that the most important communications often transcended language entirely. As they walked together through the park toward the subway entrance, two figures separated by age and background, but united by their shared commitment to protecting and empowering vulnerable voices, Samuel felt Elena's presence surrounding them like a blessing upon their continued work. The subway platform was crowded with the usual mixture of tourists, commuters, and students that characterized afternoon travel in Manhattan. As Samuel and Maya waited for their train, surrounded by the beautiful chaos of urban life, he reflected on how profoundly his relationship with this environment had changed. What had once seemed threatening and overwhelming now felt like participation in the grand symphony of human experience, each individual story contributing to a larger narrative of struggle, hope, and connection. When their train arrived, Samuel and Maya found seats near the center of the car, their presence adding to the diverse collection of lives temporarily sharing this underground journey through darkness toward light. Maya pulled out her homework while Samuel reviewed foundation documents, but both remained alert to their fellow passengers, in the way that had become second nature, after years of understanding that wisdom and warning could emerge from any source at any moment. As the train moved through the tunnels beneath Manhattan, carrying its cargo of dreams and disappointments toward destinations both mundane and extraordinary, Samuel Pierce felt the profound satisfaction that came from a life lived in service to something larger than personal advancement. The wealth that had once trapped him in isolation now flowed toward initiatives that created conditions where love could flourish, where children's voices could be heard and heeded, where communities could be strengthened by the wisdom that emerged when all members were valued regardless of age or status. And you? Have you ever encountered someone small who changed your life in an immense way? Perhaps you've dismissed a child's concerns that later proved prophetic, or maybe you've witnessed the kind of innocent wisdom that adults often overlook in their rush toward practical solutions. Tell me your story in the comments below, because every voice matters and every experience of unexpected grace deserves to be shared. If this story has touched something deep within your heart, if Samuel and Maya's journey has reminded you that miracles often come disguised as ordinary encounters with extraordinary people, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that faith can be restored, that purpose can be discovered even after profound loss, and that the most important investments we make are not in financial markets, but in the human connections that give life its meaning. The greatest treasure Samuel Pierce ever received couldn't be measured in dollars or cryptocurrency, couldn't be stored in bank vaults or investment portfolios. It was the gift of a child's trust, offered freely to a broken stranger who had forgotten how to believe in anything beyond his own accumulated grief. Maya's wooden cross still rests in his pocket today, worn smooth by years of handling, a reminder that sometimes God truly does wear the face of a child, and that those with eyes to see and ears to hear will always find their way home to love.